Well, at any rate, the definitions in the PowerPoint are general definitions of the principle of utility that just talk about the goal of utilitarianism being the promotion of the greatest good for the greatest number. And what I said is that definition does not tell us what we're to count as good. And it's a good definition because not all utilitarians adopt the same simplistic standard that Bentham and Mill adopted for moral goodness. But I said to try to get reasoning about morality down to earth where you and I live, they tried to say, well, you know what? Moral right and wrong, if we get it down to earth as a matter of promoting happiness or lessening unhappiness or pleasure, then we're dealing with something that is in the world we live in. We're not talking about morality as being, transcendent and otherworldly. And so they adopted this old Greek view from the Epicureans of hedonism. And hedonism basically says that the sole goal of morality, that is, the only thing that's good in and of itself is happiness or pleasure. That is, any other goal we might aim for might be good, but in the end, it's only good insofar as it tends to promote one's happiness or more happiness for everyone, or lessen the amount of pain and pleasure. But the only thing that's good in and of itself for hedonists is pleasure or happiness. And Mill's famous, not Mill, but Bentham's famous statement about why he adopts hedonism is on page 503 of your text. And, oh yeah. I probably ought to look into LASIK, see if I could do it. I used to not need reading glasses. Okay, what he says down towards the bottom of the page in this quote from Bentham's book, The Principles of Morals and Legislation. And again, they said Bentham was a lawyer, but he was more interested in changing the philosophical principles behind the British legal system because he thought there were a lot of injustices in the system, right? And he thought that he could correct some of those injustices if he could get people on board with utilitarian reasoning. And so he concentrated more on philosophy. So his book is The Principles of Morals and Legislation. Mill and Bentham were about trying to actually reform, their society, and they did. I mean, they were so successful that utilitarianism, as I said, is not only the reigning moral theory behind things like the criminal justice system in England and their healthcare system, because it's single payer. But it's what underlies our system. We have this word penitentiary, right? But nobody sends people to the penitentiary so that they can do penance for their sins anymore, right? That's what that word came from, right? Instead, we use terms now that are suggestive of utilitarian goals. It's not a prison, it is a correctional facility, which suggests the utilitarian goal of correcting, or rehabilitation of an inmate, rehabilitation, deterrence, protection of society, all of those goals justify punishing somebody, because in the end, the argument is you will provide more good for society as a whole than the evil that you're doing to the person you're punishing. Now, I'm not asking you to agree or disagree with this. It specifically does. Utilitarians are against the biblical view, right, which is called retributive justice, that we punish somebody because simply they deserve to be punished for what they did, and that big punishments should be reserved for big crimes and small ones for small. Utilitarians don't give that as a reason for punishing somebody. All of the reasons have to do with the balance of good versus bad and the consequences you'll produce by punishing somebody. So anyway, here's Bentham's famous quote and how he adopts hedonism. He says, "Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do as well as determine what we shall do." Right? So he says, we're going to get moral guidance from this fact that we all have to experience pain and pleasure. And his original statement of the principle of utility, and when I read it here, which is in Roman numeral 2 at the top of 504, I'm recording this, so if you don't have your book in front of you, but you play the integrity file, you can look at it. But here's Bentham's original statement, and you'll see why I put the more succinct ones in the PowerPoint. And his statement is often called the greatest happiness principle, because he doesn't talk in general about just promoting good over bad. He defines good in hedonistic terms. You'll see that. He says the principle of utility is the foundation of the present work. That is, the principles of morals and legislation. So he says, it will be proper, therefore, at the outset to give an explicit and determinate account of what is meant by it. So then he goes on to define it. He says, by the principle of utility is meant that principle which approves or disapproves of every action. That is, we can weigh every moral action we might want to do by this principle. Approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever. On what basis? Well, he goes on to answer that. According to the tendency which it appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question, or what is the same thing, in other words, to promote or oppose that happiness. So he talks about diminishing or promoting happiness. He says, I say of every action whatsoever, and therefore not only of every action of a private individual, but of every measure of government. So even from the very beginning, he was hoping that not only people's individual moral decisions would be made in a following utilitarianism, but that government policies. Now, we saw the happiness calculus in action. And, I wanted to point that out. This is linked to the video I showed on utilitarianism, you know, if you weren't there that day. That machine did that just to spite me. See, and they are self-conscious. They know what's going on, you know. So anyway, all you have to do is click on this, and it'll take you immediately to it. I'm not going to do it, but there it is in Blackboard in the announcements. And you may have already gotten the announcement on your phone or elsewhere. So anyway, what we saw is that for Bentham, if we're trying to decide, well, you know, what's the right thing to do? Should we take our nephew to the circus or stay home and read a book? In a utilitarian manner, we would weigh the consequences, good and bad, and come down on the side with the better consequences. And it's not always a plus versus a minus. Sometimes it's more of a plus on one side than the other, or it could be a minus versus a minus. So anyway, you balance those things out, and But you might say, well, how do we get these numbers? Your book goes into some stuff that I don't usually like to go into in any great detail. I don't want you to memorize his, really it was 7 marks on page 505. But just a few of them. In other words, Bentham said what we would keep in mind about pains and pleasures are things like, number one, their intensity, right? In other words, a pain that's more intense gets more of a negative value, right, than a lesser pain. Or a more intense pleasure gets more of a positive value. Their duration, right? We got a multi-billion-dollar pain reliever industry, over-the-counter pain relief, because if I can take, you know, a Tylenol or something and a headache that might go on for 2 or 3 hours, I can get rid of in half an hour or something like that. That is, if I can lessen the duration of something that's bad, I want to do that, right? So he says, you know, how long a pleasure or pain lasts. Not talking too much about some of these others, but certainty or uncertainty. If those of you who drive, if you're filling up your car at a gas station, let's suppose you can only get $19 in the tank, and you gave them a 20, and you're getting $1 and change, but you think, I'm going to do something with $1. You know, it's burning a hole in your pocket. So you have the choice of getting, say, a Hershey bar or a bag of chips or something there, right? An immediate pleasure. Or you might consider buying a lottery ticket for the money. Now, if you hit the lottery, even if it was just on a 3-digit number, presumably you'd get more resources, and you could, if money would promote your happiness, you'd get more happiness if you hit the lottery. But you know that there's a lot of uncertainty involved in whether or not you're going to hit the lottery, even on a 3-digit number, that's not there if you decide to buy a Hershey bar, right? There's a 100% chance you're going to enjoy the pleasure of the Hershey bar whereas maybe 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000 that you're going to hit the lottery if you're just playing numbers. And so things like certainty, uncertainty, and he had other things that I don't want to go in with, but these were the things that Bentham thought we'd take into account to figure out these numbers. But again, one of the things, though, that we saw last time, I want to go down one because this one's set to not display everything once, is that it may be a little unrealistic to think we can really make comparisons like this. One is that we can't see in other people's minds. We can't see, know how much pain or pleasure they are having. And also, utilitarianism has us not just try to figure out how much pain or pleasure you're having right now, but we're looking at future consequences. And it's not, there was a time when Uncle Vic had to realize that just going out and buying Christmas gifts for all my niece and numerous nephews wasn't going to cut it as they got older. That it wasn't necessarily going to work to, just get them some neat little toy. In other words, no guarantee that they would enjoy it. I once dated for a short time a divorcee that had 2 young children in Charlottesville. And there was a local fair outside of Charlottesville. And we went to that, and I paid to get us in. And the thing is, they made an announcement at the fair that there was going to be a demolition derby. Now, my brother and I grew up, in Baltimore City. We would have loved to see cars crashing into one another, when we were growing up, right? But these are basically kind of rural kids. And so, I thought, okay, and it required paying for an extra ticket, but I did, and we went. And, the kids did not enjoy it, which surprised me. I think they were afraid the cars were going to explode. Later, I learned that they take the real gas tank out, and they replace it with a quart plastic jug of gasoline, so there's very little chance that and plus they take most of the windows out, so they're not going to shatter. So they're safety precautions they take. For a car that's in a demolition derby is not just a car that they took off the street and drove in there. But I didn't know that back then to explain it. So anyway, you can't always predict future results, even in something as simple as how much pleasure a kid is going to get out of a gift you're giving them, but also Bentham thought that we could, let's see, this is a 6, didn't it? That we could do more, that we could actually assign numbers in an objective way. And this seems very suspicious. The subjective quality of pleasures and pains makes standardization of a countable unit problematic. What do I mean? Well, his countable unit, in other words, if you're going to measure something, like measuring the temperature in this room, you have to have some countable unit. For temperature, it's a degree Fahrenheit or a degree Celsius, right? For pleasures and pains, he had hedons. But the point is, how can we say in any kind of objective way what's to count as 1 hedon's worth of pleasure? And it doesn't seem that we can really do that, And as a result, you really can't assign exact numbers in the way that we could assign an exact number to how hot it is in here, or vice versa, with temperature. And so Bentham seemed a little too optimistic in thinking we could measure pleasures and pains. But nonetheless, we do make comparisons about pleasures and pains, right? I mean, I can say, look, if I'm prone to headaches, I can say, look, I'm having a much worse headache today than what I had yesterday. And I said, hospitals do have scales of 1 to 10, for pain. But again, it's still only a rough and ready guess, So making that we can make these informal comparisons, my headache today is worse than it was yesterday, doesn't mean that we can assign exact numbers in the way Bentham thought we could. So, but as I said, I think last time this thing isn't going to go quickly. So, basically, contemporary utilitarianism uses a cost-benefit analysis. In other words, if we were going to look at that video and talk about whether to build the Bakun Dam, one way we could reason as utilitarians reason is to talk about balancing out the potential pleasure and happiness of a higher lifestyle for maybe 1 million or more people in Malaysia because they would have cheaper electricity and all the trappings that go along with it, right? The ability to use appliances in their home to lighten their workload. This is one reason why we build these dams in our country. What do factories use? A lot of them use not only electricity, but a lot of it. Unfortunately, it's unfortunate to me that we did a lot of bad things to our country when we allowed our industrialists to ship so much manufacturing overseas. It was penny wise and pound foolish. When I was in college, folks, I paid my way as a carpenter's son. My parents it never occurred to them that my brother and I might want to go to college someday. The thought was we were going to do a hitch in the Army like our dad and then learn some trade. My brother's a pharmacist, right? He went to University of Maryland School of Pharmacy. So we both did higher education. So the idea of saving for our college education never occurred to them. But I was able to put myself through a private college, Asbury in Kentucky, largely by working in factories in the summertime and by working some at Christmas time and getting some help from my parents. And there was only one time when I had to take out a loan. But those aren't there anymore for the most part. It's too bad. But what gets around this problem of accountable unit is a cost-benefit analysis. Because another way we can talk about whether to build something like the Bakun Dam is in the economic benefits of building the dam versus the costs. And this is how Cass Sunstein wants us to weigh federal policies by utilitarian calculations to say, well, is the benefit of having that policy or that part of that agency are the benefits more than the costs to operate it? And he says if the answer is no, if we do a self-examination, then maybe we shouldn't have that program going on anymore. So So for Bentham, then, you know, you can kind of save utilitarian reasoning by talking about a cost-benefit analysis, and we know very well what's to count as a dollar, even though we may not know what's to count as a hedon, a unit of pleasure or pain. I'm going to pause this pretty quickly, but just give you an idea of the sorts of stuff, you know, you might look at to answer some of these. So section 1, again, your exam is Monday, May 11th. You know, so don't get it confused, because it's section 2, the 11 o'clock section that is on Friday, May 15th. So we have some stuff on freedom of the will, right? The first one is on the concept of fate, specifically on the Oedipus story, right? What was Oedipus' fate? How did he try to avoid it? But most of this is pretty straightforward, right? How did he wind up fulfilling his destiny anyway? You know, and his father ended up fulfilling his you know, predicted destiny. And of course, you know, the bottom line of the story is there's a fate that either the gods have determined for us, or that the gods may know, but the universe is determined. And really, we're powerless to prevent that fate from happening. So whatever choices they made turned out not, you know, to be totally ineffectual in keeping their fate from coming about, you know. And so you can emphasize where... now, something we haven't spent a lot of time on, basically, Iocasta, his wife, doesn't really want to know much about whether the prophecies really did come true, whereas Oedipus wants to know. And if you read this in high school, right, don't they both find out and commit suicide, or is it one of them that commits them? But they eventually do find out, and they're shattered by it, you know. And I think they both end up doing themselves in. Okay, 2 is something that, I mean, there are other concepts of fate, like astrology. But now, you know, astrology has been around a long time, but there are still people who read their horoscope in the newspaper. There are still people who think, you know, there probably is a kind of fate in store for me. And you can also bring in karma. Again, I said the selection on karma that's in your book is a little hard to read, even for a professional philosopher, because you'd have to know more background about the way they discuss things in Eastern philosophy. But 2 is one that you can answer in a number of ways. Is there any good reason why a mature, intelligent, 21st century person like yourselves, right, should take the concept of fate seriously, or think that any of his or her actions are governed by it? You know, and again, you can have a good answer to this question either way. Because, you know, as in your essays in previous tests, I'm not grading things on what position you take. You know. Okay, and we will do some review. There will be a separate review sheet that I got to get finished on this. how would the hard determinists reply to each of the following criticisms? And again, for hard determinism, your book mentioned a little bit about Laplace, and remember there's a PowerPoint on that. We didn't go over all of it, but especially the beginning about hard determinism is good, you know. And, you know, we looked at that selection of de Holbach where he says that everything we do is governed by the laws of nature and nothing we do is free. And we're really, at rock bottom, not responsible for anything we do. And, of course, we saw that was the line that Clarence Darrow basically took as well as a defense attorney. But how would the hard determinists, somebody like de Holbach or Darrow, reply the following criticisms? A, when I make a choice, I could have chosen differently. Well, obviously they don't believe you could have chosen differently. If the background causes are all the same and you chose A, in any situation where the prior causes were exactly the same, you would have to choose A, even though you thought you could deliberate. The fact that I have to deliberate before making a decision proves that I am not determined. Well, we may think we're deliberating between an A and B choice, but of course the hard determinist is going to say, well, you know, that's only an illusion. You're not really deliberating. Again, the background causes leading up to your decision have forced you to decide only one way, and that you think you're deliberating is only something where you're kidding yourself. It's all those background causes that force you to make the choice you ultimately make, and that you've convinced yourself you've chosen freely. C, it is impossible to predict another person's behavior. Well, here we get into those slides about Laplace's demon. In other words, I can't predict what you're going to do this afternoon, but that's simply because, number one, I don't have information about all the causal factors that go into your decision. And also, even if I had that information, I wouldn't be able to make all of the calculations about how they would affect your decision either way. But Laplace's demon, who does have all that information, you know, again, in modern times we would talk about something like a supercomputer having all that information. You know, his demon has all of the information it needs about all of the prior causes, the positions of the atoms and molecules that go into your deciding what to do this afternoon. And Laplace's demon is a lightning-fast calculator, like a supercomputer, right? No supercomputers around in the, I think Laplace wrote in the 1600s. I'm a bad history student, but it was hundreds of years ago. No computers around back then. So he imagines this creature that has these powers. But the idea is, in principle, if determinism, in the way the hard determinists say, is true, in principle, if we had all that information and could do the calculations, we could predict everything you're going to choose to do this afternoon with the certainty that I can predict that this cup of coffee, if I leave it here this afternoon, is going to get cold. It's not going to be warm. Okay, so that's 3. That's what I'm thinking about there. 4 is a long question, but it focuses on Leopold and Loeb. Now, you can, if you want to, you know, you can pull Darrow's testimony up. Your book, I think, gives a little bit of it, but it's there on the internet. It's long. He went on for hours, but, you know, if you wanted to look at it or read some. But, you know, there's abundant evidence that they wanted to commit their murder. Now, this talks about what we saw in the video is soft determinism. You know, in other words, Darrow is a hard determinist, but a soft determinist could say, hey, look, Darrow's wrong. These young men were responsible for their actions because they wanted to commit the murder, for the challenge of it and the planning of it. And if we do what we really want to do, then for soft determinists, even if our actions are determined by the laws of nature, if we do what we want to do, then we're responsible morally and legally for what we do. That's soft determinism, the idea that even if our actions are determined by the laws of nature, for the soft determinists, there's still enough room for moral responsibility. If we talk about being responsible for things that are motivated by some inner psychological motive. I wanted to do something. I'm motivated by a belief I have. You know, for soft determinists, the things that we're not responsible for are basically things that we're coerced into doing, right? You know, somebody coerces you into making a decision you normally wouldn't make, they would say you're not responsible for that. Okay, so I basically say, are the soft determinists right, or you know, is Darrow right in question 4, without reading that whole long question. 5 asks you to basically talk about how you would make a decision on utilitarian grounds using something like Bentham's simple calculus, and then it asks you to assess some of these reasons for, you know, why there are drawbacks to using it, you know. And finally, 6 should be pretty obvious. It asks you to discuss the more complicated example where you can use utilitarian reasoning found in the video. Again, the video link is there in that announcement, right? They bounce back and forth in that video between the practical problem of whether to build a hydroelectric power dam and the pluses and minuses of it in terms of displacing native peoples, influence on the environment, you know, versus heightened standards of living for many more people in Malaysia. So basically, if you look at the video, you can, you know, it'll give you some stuff to bring in writing 6. And as I said, that video is the only one of the series that's legally online because the people who make the videos are using that as their demo, basically. Okay, so we'll do some review. I may just stop it at Bentham. We're not going to have any time to do more than some review next time. I don't know. I didn't put a John Stuart Mill question on. He tries to complicate the theory by bringing in qualitative distinctions. It's not just quantity of pleasure we need to take into account, but he talked about higher pleasures versus lower pleasures, because people thought, well, utilitarianism, by focusing just on pleasure and making us creatures of nothing but pain and pleasure, is a moral theory that gives us a rather low view of human beings. You know, what's different? In other words, if I get as much pleasure from listening to Beethoven as the pig out there in the field does from eating slop, and this is where Bentham seemed to have gone there, the only thing that matters about pleasure is getting the same quantity, then what's different, you know, between me and the pig out there in the field? And John Stuart Mill, Bentham's pupil, tried to defend utilitarianism against the charge that it was something that gives us a low view of human beings. I didn't make that. They charge it as a pig morality, basically, because it just looks at all pleasures as being on a par. Basically, the gist of Mill's response is there are higher pleasures that only human beings can appreciate, and it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool or a pig satisfied. Better to have a lower quantity of a higher quality pleasure, like the pleasures of discussing philosophy or reading a book or going to a play, you know. But Mill gets criticized because what are the higher pleasures for him? Well, exactly the sorts of things that a sophisticated 19th century, well-educated British intellectual is going to call the higher pleasures, right? So he gets criticized as being elitist. But I don't think, I'm not going to give you questions on Mill's quality distinction, because I don't think we're going to be able to cover it, you know, if I do some review. Maybe we'll get to it. You know, I haven't made up the final test yet, but so okay. I don't want to make you late for your next class. So if anybody came in late, again, I would ask you not to share this with somebody in the 11 o'clock, because I'm going to give them this out, but I'm going to wait till Friday, because their exam is a week from Friday. Yours is a week from Monday. Yeah, pardon? These are the exam questions. Let me. Oh, okay. That's good. I'll put it with the others. Let me. Okay, definitely better late than never. Okay.